Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Welcome to a very special edition of Encounters here on Akal channel. Today we have a live election 2017 debate. We were hoping to have 5 prospective candidates for you and a live audience handpicked. We do have a live audience. We only have 3 MPs prospective that we're going to grill today. So the Hunger Games Encounter style begins now. We're going to leave an empty chair because the Conservatives did say to us that at some point in the evening they will have a candidate that will participate, so that chair remains empty for them to fill. And the Liberal Democrats candidate Lee Darg offered his sincere apologies because he became ill during the day and progressively it got worse, so he was unable to attend. So with us today are Chris Williamson, representing Labour in Derby North. We have Samantha Pankeri, who is a Green MP, and she will be representing her constituents, hopefully on June the 9th, from Stone in Staffordshire. And we have the independent MP, who will be supported by the newly formed Panth Party, Mr. Jagmeet Singh. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Welcome. I was only joking about the Hunger Games, but it might be a little bit that way, especially when I introduce to you who will be asking the questions tonight, and that is the audience. The audience is made up of Mrs. Sukhwinder Kaur, who is a activist and a charity worker with Sikh Relief, the charity that most at home will be aware of their work and what they do. And Dr. Gurnam Singh, who is a lecturer of sociology at Coventry University, a social activist and a presenter here at Akal channel, as you well know. We have Mr. Jaswant Bora, who is an author and expert on extremism and radicalisation. We have Dr. Manjeet Kaur Vihal and her colleague Suba Rasab, who both work for CRASAC, which is an arm of the Rape Crisis Centre, the National Rape Crisis Centre. We have Jagveer Singh, who is a postgraduate and social activist. We have Dr. Pyara Singh Bogle, who is representing today the Sikh Council UK. He is the Vice Secretary General of that. And we have with us finally, and not by any means least, we have with us Jasveer Singh Gill, who is the brains and the mind behind the Sikh Press Association. So without further ado, let us go ahead and ask the first question, which will be my first and only question formally. I will sort of interject if I feel that something needs to be repeated or clarified. But the first question is to our panel. With apathy being the enemy of a democratic process, and with MPs' expenses, the last election having a very minimal voter turnout, why should anybody engage with the political process only 2 years after a general election? Chris?
Well, I think that Labour has now put forward a very radical progressive agenda in our manifesto. This is the best manifesto that Labour has produced since 1945. Some people have characterised it as extreme left, hard left. I don't see it that way. For me, it's not a matter of left and right, it's a matter of right and wrong. And, you know, for far too long, I think, political parties, the mainstream political parties, including the Labour Party, New Labour, which is a kind of sort of a new political party, Tony Benn once suggested, cuckoos in the nest, I think he described it as being, became too close to the Conservative Party. And I think a lot of people, therefore, switched off the political process. And there is a lot of talk about, you know, Labour lost over 5 million votes from 1997 through to 2010. But what is less talked about is the fact that Labour lost 3 million votes between 1997 and the next election in 2001, where the turnout, I think, was under 60%. And I think a lot of people became disillusioned and cynical about politics because they felt that, you know, the parties all became too close. Now, in my opinion, it's always better having a Labour government than a Conservative one. You'd expect me to say that. And even under those new Labour years, whilst I don't think they went anywhere near far enough and they didn't, you know, fundamentally transform the economy and society in the way in which I think they should have done, they did nevertheless put extra money into our public services, to our NHS and to education and so on.
But what they didn't do is make those fundamental changes which I think were needed. Now, in the last election, there was quite a lot of good things, I think, in our manifesto, but Ed Balls, our Shadow Chancellor at the time, was still talking about an austerity-light programme. So we were going into that election promising to make cuts still. And I think that actually did disillusion people, and they didn't feel that there was sufficient difference. And I certainly had that because I was the MP until 2015 in Derby North, and the Green Party stood in Derby North on that occasion, even though I'd been described as the greenest MP elected in 2010, and which is quite an accolade because Caroline Lucas was elected in that year as well. There was a sense that, I think, certainly within the Green Party activists in Derby who stood, that, you know, Labour just wasn't offering a sufficiently progressive agenda, and that's why they stood, even though, you know, they quite liked the sort of programme that I stood for, and the opinion polls suggested we were going to win by a handsome margin anyway, and a lot of Green voters were telling me it's safe to vote Green in Derby North because you're going to win by a landslide, Chris. Now, there were, just to kind of conclude, there were 15.6 million people across the country who didn't vote in the last election. In my own constituency of Derby North, 25,000 people did not vote. And the Tories won with 16,500, and we got just under 16,500. They only won by 41 votes. And what we've got to therefore do, it seems to me, is put forward a programme, and I hope and believe that this will engage with, has engaged with a lot more people, certainly a lot more young people are engaging with politics. And there was a poll, if you believe polls anymore, that was published, I think yesterday or the day before, YouGov, of 18 to 24-year-olds. 67% say they are certain to vote, and within that cohort, Labour has a 37% lead over the Conservatives. I firmly believe, therefore, that if we can reach out and mobilise those young people, Labour will win this election. And that's what we've got to do. We've got to demonstrate there's clear red water, if you like, between the Tories and the Labour Party. I believe this manifesto does it. It remains to be seen whether we actually do mobilise people on the day, but I'm hopeful that this will actually achieve that result.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also quite a big fan of Labour's current manifesto. You know, a lot of the things that were in there were in our 2015 manifesto, so it's great to see that Labour have caught up with the ideas that we've been supporting for quite some time. But just coming back to the question, why should people bother to engage? We only had the general election 2 years ago, the EU referendum last year. I mean, I certainly know people I'm talking to on the street have election fatigue and are just exhausted by the whole process and fed up of politicians coming out and saying, trust us, you can definitely trust us, maybe you shouldn't trust us, you know, and that's how people feel. I think the reason that people with this particular election must engage with the process and must go out and vote is because we've seen the price of not engaging already. You know, we've seen what low turnout does, you know, and Chris particularly has personal experience of that, you know, losing his seat largely, you know, because of low turnout. And again, you know, where I live in Stoke-on-Trent, we were the only constituency in the country to have more people who didn't vote than did. You know, 49% turnout, I mean, 51% of people didn't even vote. You know, so this engagement, this election particularly, I feel that the stakes are so much higher than with other general elections. We're not just talking about which party do we want to form the next government for the next 5 years. With Brexit coming up and those negotiations on the table, we're voting for the people that we want to shape the future of our country for generations to come. The things that are going to be negotiated as part of that deal will affect our children and our children's children, and really we're talking about our entire national collective future here. So people who are choosing to not engage in that are doing themselves an enormous disservice there. We have a real problem in politics of it being incredibly, it's male and pale and stale, and you only have to look at the Prime Minister's questions and you see the embarrassment there, you know, all these white men sitting around and barking at each other. And you know, I think that in order to change that system, in order to bring about democratic reform and electoral reform, we've got to get people engaging in that system and saying politics is something that affects all of us, it's something that we do, it's not something that you do to us. And I'm really hoping that that's something that we can start the process of with this election. And it starts on June the 8th, it doesn't end on June the 8th.
Thank you. Just Jagmeet.
Just want to say to the Sangat Vaheguru Ji Ka
Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
So your question dealt with apathy from voters and low voter turnout.
Yeah, and the lack of trust.
And the lack of trust. The truth is, the answer is not going to come from a broken system. So what we've heard so far is literally the rehashing of 30 years of what's been going on. I believe that the answer is going to come from you, the people, the voters out there, the disengaged. It's up to the few, somebody, to try to invigorate and enliven them and ask them to step forward and take participation themselves. With God's blessing, I myself have started a new party with the local community and the national community. It's called the Panth Party, and it's a brand new initiative to actually reach out to those people that don't trust politicians. One of the main reasons people do not trust politicians is because all of the double talk. Nobody actually tells it to you straight. They will give you a roundabout answer. You can watch Theresa May do it as a classic example, and you can watch a lot of Tory politicians do it to a T, and unfortunately, when we do ask them to come, some of them just don't bother showing up, which I hope they come, but don't hold your breath. That being said, we need straight talking, honest people. And I would say everybody needs to keep paying attention to what's happened. The fact is that 50% or over 50% of under 25-year-olds that are actually registered to vote, they don't bother showing up to the polls, and I don't blame them. I blame the people that uninspired them. And the truth is that the system is set and created in such a way that it's set up to make you apathetic. It's set up to not make you want to vote. It's set up in such a horrible way. So we, the people, need to start demanding more from our government, again, now, for the next 5 years, for the next 10 years, for our children's generation. Because if we're apathetic now, we can't be apathetic for our children's generation. It's up to our generation and the people that are around now to get involved and spark a change that could actually create real change. One thing I've seen in my life is change does not come from politicians. Change never comes from politicians. Change comes from the regular people putting pressure on politicians. So it's when you, the regular people, choose, the ordinary common man, woman, the British public choose to have a different world, then we will have that world. Now, I want to finish by saying, myself, I was one of those apathetic people. I was one of those people that thought, why would I ever vote for any of these people who never tell us the truth and are just in it for their own gain, towing the party line, and just for themselves? Why would I possibly waste my time? Because it's never going to affect any real change in my life. And then two major world events happened. First was Brexit. I never expected Brexit to result in the United Kingdom leaving Europe. And I'm pretty sure 99% of the world was with me when we were shocked to wake up that morning. I followed it through the night. The Pro and the Remain leaders did not expect it to happen because they all ended up quitting or getting fired immediately afterwards. Now you tell me what that says about your leadership if they all have to leave their jobs immediately after the biggest vote in our generation. The system is broken. The second is the rise of Trump. I'm not a Donald Trump fan, but that candidacy started as a political joke. It was satire to a T. And it ended with a buffoon being in the most powerful seat in the world, arguably. So these two major world events opened my eyes, and it said, you know what? This thing in the West called democracy, where everybody shows up, places one vote, they do get counted, and the unexpected can happen. And personally, I had never seen that in my lifetime until twice in 18 months. So then I thought, you know what? We must get involved. So I implore everybody, show up on June the 8th, but from now until then, do as much research and look within inside your hearts to find who is telling you the truth. Nationally, I'll say it right now, I do love Greens, because you know what? The Greens, they support what? The earth. So I love that. And I do like Labour. I'm a fan of Jeremy Corbyn. Now these are my quote-unquote opponents, but I'll tell it to you straight, I love them both. I wish them the best of luck for where they are, because they're going to be good for our country and my children and your children. Nationally, I do like Labour to win. I don't trust a Tory as far as I can throw one. Locally, in Wolverhampton Southwest, it must be myself, the independent candidate, because nobody else you can trust to do the job for you. Another Tory at the table in Parliament will only toe the party line. A weak, individual from Labour that is not going to actually work for the constituents of Wolverhampton Southwest is not going to help you. What we need is fresh blood. And I'm excited for this particular election because this is a chance for Wolverhampton Southwest to get on the map nationally and send a global message that says we care about everybody, the marginalized, the poor people. We do not only care about big business. We care about every individual in our society, and we want you to care. And together, I believe we can make a massive difference and make the apathetic into activists like myself.
Thank you, Jagmeet Singh. Can I just say politely that due to the constraints of time, if we can keep our answers as concise as possible so we can move on question, rather than long-winded answers, just the easy, I think half of the apathy we're going to experience from our audience today is going to be one of being over-explained to. So if we can, when we move on to the questions now, if you can answer them as concisely as possible, because then it allows for the elaboration of the point also, because they may have a follow-up question, which they may well forget by the time the answer is complete. So if we can, I think a very relevant question at the moment would be in the wake of the atrocities we've seen in the north of England and in Manchester. If I think maybe Suba Rasab would like to ask a question. And I think that Sukhi Kaur has something very, very relevant to add to that, to the question. So it will be a double question, so to speak, or double-barreled.
Okay, so my question is really more around hate crime, in particular towards the Muslim community. And what my question is that hate crime against Muslim women, like Gurmukh said about, since those attacks and since things like Westminster have increased, there's an organisation called Tal Mama who actually record anti-Muslim hate crimes, and they have reported that since Manchester, they received, just a day after, they received 50 reports within that day. Usually they get 7 to 10 reports, so it was a massive increase. So what my question really is what is you and your party going to do to make sure that Muslims within our communities are safe, but also to ensure that they're not being attacked, they're not being ostracised, and further division isn't being caused within our societies, and not just Muslim communities, but those people who are perceived as Muslim, because we know they're also attacked because of ignorance. What are you practically going to do to ensure their safety within our communities and really bring back that unity?
Sukhi?
Go on.
Mine's very similar. I mean, over a third of the BAME community have been racially abused or have witnessed racist abuse since the Brexit vote. And recently, a report by the Trades Union Congress has revealed that more recently, crime has doubled since the Brexit vote, since the Manchester attack as well. I mean, our country at the moment is more divided than ever. How will you, the government, at a national and local level, work with local agencies to prioritise community cohesion and bring about tougher sanctions as well for those people who are, going out racially abusing? Because many people just don't want to report it because it's like, what's going to be done? So, there has to be something around sanctions, around hate crime. So what would you guys do to tackle that? Thank you.
Chris, if you'd like to start again.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think first and foremost is that Labour has very clearly said that we would reinvest in our public services. And I think one of the problems that we've now got is it's not just in terms of policing, which has been decimated, frankly, as a result of funding cuts. And, we've heard Tory Home Secretary saying, well, crime has fallen, so there's not a correlation between police numbers and the amount of crime. I do think there is an issue about making people feel safe. Often the actuality of crime lags behind fear of crime. So we need to do something about that. One of the things we've said is we'll reverse the cuts in our public services, reverse the cuts that have been made in policing numbers. We will recruit 10,000 new police officers. That's the first thing. Also make sure that we are properly resourcing the intelligence services within the police services, up and down the constabularies. In terms of, I was listening to a Newsnight report, and they were interviewing a security expert who was suggesting that it's only the Metropolitan Police that has the appropriate resources really to respond to the challenges. Every other constabulary, according to this expert, is really lagging behind. So there's that. But I think we've also got to be doing more in terms of investing in our youth services and providing for the sort of activities which are really important, because it's often young people who end up being radicalised, and we need to find ways of ensuring that we can protect those young people and give them the support that they need to prevent that from happening in the first place. Now, I've had a little bit of experience of this when I was I was leader of the council, but it was before that, when I was a deputy leader. There's an organisation called Al Mujahirun, you may have heard of. I think they're a banned organisation now, and they were recruiting a lot of young people with Pakistani heritage in Derby. And we, after picking up the point was made, nothing's ever achieved really simply by politicians bestowing goodly works. I mean, a bit of that comes, but it's often as a result of pressure from below. And there was representations made to me about what we could do, and a suggestion that we employ some specialist youth workers who could engage directly with those young people. And this is what we did, and it had an absolutely brilliant effect. It worked, and the young people that had been attracted by Al Mujahirun stopped being attracted by them because there were other activities and youth work directed towards them. So I think it's really important that we're investing in our youth service, investing in our policing, investing in our education service, and tackling some of the problems that lead to resentment, and which is sometimes then taken out on the BAME community. And that means giving people hope again. And this is why I come back to this manifesto. I think it absolutely does that. Because we're talking about creating decent jobs again. We're talking about a minimum wage of £10 an hour, tackling the housing crisis. And I sometimes hear it on the doorstep as I go round about, immigration is the cause of the housing problem. Immigration is the cause of low wages. Immigration is the cause of our public services being under pressure. Of course, that's not true. But it's a difficult argument to challenge really, and get people thinking. I always say, look, lift your eyes above the horizon and look at what is actually causing these problems. So I think an economy that works for ordinary people, investing in our public services, investing in our youth services, etc., I think would have a fundamental impact, actually protect people, and go a long way towards reducing and hopefully eliminating the radicalisation which some young people have been duped into getting involved with.
Chris, if I may, what does the Labour manifesto say on how would it tackle somebody like you've mentioned, Al Mujahirun? The figurehead of that is, of course, Anjem Choudary. He is still in a position to influence young, impressionable children. He hasn't been stopped from what he's doing, and continually proscribing the different names of his organisations is only a paper exercise.
No, I agree.
So what does the Labour manifesto have by way of remedying that?
Yeah, well, I mean, you're right, and I don't think simply prescribing organisations is the way forward, locking people up. You've got to actually win, hearts and minds. You've got to win, the battle of ideas, and it comes back to, this isn't rocket science, I don't think. This is about, and as I come back to the point, it's about, making sure we're investing in our public services, that we're working with our communities and allowing communities to have a greater influence over how public services are actually delivered in our communities. And when we do that...
Is it simply a matter of public services?
It's not just a matter of public service. It's about public services working in concert with the community. And I think it's really important, therefore, that we have a kind of, if you like, a sort of neighbourhood approach, really, a neighbourhood agenda, whereby, communities are empowered as well. But it's a complex issue because it's about public services, it's about empowering communities, it's about giving communities, the ability to influence those public services. It's about tackling, the economic deprivation which exists in our society at the moment, and tackling some of those resentments, because the extremism isn't just, confined to people who are attracted by ISIL. You have the right-wing extremists, the English Defence League, and even more extreme organisations than that. And we know, of course, the tragic murder of Joe Cox last year by a fascist extremist, is an example of that. And
the Sikh was almost beheaded in Wales.
Absolutely,
by somebody with a similar mindset.
Well, absolutely right. And so, it's a complex thing, and it's about all these pieces of the jigsaw really being brought together. But you're not going to achieve that, though, while ever we have a programme of austerity, which I think is exacerbating this problem, actually. And you know, as I say, I'm a big supporter of ensuring that, you know, we have good quality public services that are working in, you know, collaboration with the community at large. And I think that partnership arrangement, it gives you a fighting chance of overcoming the extremism. And as I say, I've had a small example of the situation in Derby, whereby this type of approach can actually work.
Okay, Samantha, do you need reminding of the original question?
No, I wrote them down.
Okay.
So just coming back to the original question, you know, what would you do to tackle hate crimes against Muslim people and people who are perceived as being Muslim, and you know, protecting people? I think we have to look at who the perpetrators are, largely, of these hate crimes, and they are generally young, radicalised white males. And I think that using that term radicalised is really important, because people tend to assume that it only applies to, you know, the Muslim radicalisation, and it doesn't. It really is applicable to as you said, the right wings, the rise of neo-Nazism and fascism. And I think actually a large portion of that comes back to the media and how the media portrays Muslims. You know, you only have to Google very quickly to look at the headlines of you know, certain right-wing newspapers to see that the hysteria that is propagated, you know, and what you have here, I took a really interesting quiz online, and it was written to see if you could tell the difference between right-wing anti-Muslim propaganda and 1930s Nazi anti-Jew propaganda. And it just took sentences and phrases that had appeared in propaganda from the 1930s and the newspapers since probably for the past 4 or 5 years. And the number that you could not tell the difference was absolutely astonishing. And it's something that you know, people are starting to recognize more and more, is that Muslims are being scapegoated in the media. And it's really telling when you have incidents like, you know, we've seen just yesterday in America with the 2 young men who were murdered by a white supremacist, a known white supremacist who was known to the authorities for those extremist views. We had, as you say, the tragic murder of Joe Cox last year. And then really interestingly, this week as well, there was a young white British man who was convicted of trying to put a bomb on a London Underground train, and convicted for that. Did anybody hear the word terrorist used in conjunction with him? Because I didn't. If he had been Muslim or presented as Muslim, that would have been everywhere. It really would have been. And that's something that I feel is driving the division here. And it's fueling the right wing. It's fueling the impressionable people who are full of hate because they're full of fear. And they're full of fear because, and I think that there is a certain, you know, definitely really important level of truth in the fact that it comes back to people perceiving that there is injustice, that they need to stand up and fight against, you know, housing and the NHS and education are all under threat, and they're being pointed this way, saying blame these people over here, blame migrants, and especially if they happen to be Muslim, we'll give you a really good reason to hate them there. And all that happens then is, while we're fighting amongst ourselves, we're not pointing fingers at the true culprits, the people in power. And we're not, I mean, I suppose I come back to banging my tin drum about electoral reform, but the only way we can really challenge that is to break up the media monopoly, because all of these papers that print all this hateful thing and drive this division are owned by a very small group of people. You break up that monopoly, you get more diversity in who actually controls the media, you get more diversity and representation in Parliament, in the decision makers, and you start to see public services being invested in properly. You start to see facts and proper representation of this amazing multicultural country we have actually out there in the media, in culture, in entertainment, and you find that hatred and that division, you know, works itself out. But it is almost like a set of dominoes you have lined up, and you have to pick which one do you go for first. Do you tackle the media first? Do you tackle investment in public services? Do you know, try and get better people into government? And it is a really intricate thing, but I think to me it comes back so much to how the media portray people and the difference in how people are treated if they're white and if they're not.
Thank you for that, Samantha. Jagmeet Singh, your views, please.
Thank you for the question. I just want to say, before I answer the question, that, you know, it might be worth Akal Channel prepping their guests in regards to how much time they are allowed before the live show starts, because I don't think anybody really knows how much time we are given, or maybe some kind of a timer might work, but that can be taken up later. In regards to the question at hand, I will try to keep my answer as short and concise as possible. First, my heart goes out to everybody affected in the terrible tragedy, the terrorist attack on Manchester, with 22 young souls and families being butchered and massacred. So I think, number one, to deal with the issues that our public, our citizens are facing, we have to understand where their hatred comes from, where it stems from. So obviously a terrorist threat and alert and situation and an actual attack here will cause problems for the regular Muslims that have actually nothing to do with it. And myself being Sikh, I know this firsthand because our Sikhs, men and women, children themselves, we often get, unfortunately, profiled as the worst kind of Muslim, the terrorists that you might see on the TV, the Osama bin Laden types, because they just happen to wear a turban and a beard, which is not indicative of 99% of householder Muslims. So I think one of the things that we can do is start admitting that we have a problem and getting the mechanisms in place to report the problem. Because I believe government is not going to ever do anything unless they have the data to back what they have to do. So I know that the Sikhs, the Sikh Council UK, and a lot of Sikh organizations have got together, and they've actually got something called Sikh Aware now, where it's a website where you can go and put in any kind of verbal abuse, hate crime, whatever it is, whatever you think if it's important or not important, if it's big or small. If we start logging it, then we can start tracking what pockets of society have this problem. And obviously this is needed for the Muslim community, the LGBTQ community, the Jewish community, the black community, any minority community that may be marginalized. So first we need to start tracking and speaking up. Another thing is you do see a lot of times videos go around on YouTube where people are being attacked, and I think one of the most shameful things that comes out of the video is you have a large portion of the public around them that don't actually say anything. So I would request everybody to actually engage the abusers, and one or two positive voices can stifle a negative voice, and they might think twice about doing it again. So we as a community must stand up and remember that that it goes beyond what our physical appearance is. Yourself being Muslim, you're just as much my sister as a white woman, as a black woman, or a Sikh woman. We're all one family. So we have to recognize each other as one family and start taking care of each other in that way. The last thing I'll say, because I know we are limited on time, is we need diversity in your government. How can the common man on the street relate to a person of a different appearance if they're not represented by the government that governs them? We have 0 Sikh MPs, noticeable Sikh MPs, in Parliament. 0. And that's absolutely non-representative when the Sikh population being anywhere from 400,000 to 700,000, depending on what statistics you take. We're at least 1% of the UK population. That should equate to at least 6 to 7 MPs in Parliament. We have 0 right now, and we as a people, the white man, the black man, the Indian man, everybody has a responsibility to elect a more representative government, and then we can at least start tackling these deals in a very real way.
Jamisa, thank you for your answer. If I may, if I can just reiterate, the question was from you've answered the Sikh portion of that question. The other portion of the question was about hate crime towards Muslim women. That is recorded. There are figures for that. There is an organisation called Salmama that does exactly that. And that after the Manchester attack, there were 50 reports, and it's only been days since that. And they're used to their volumes are normally 7 or 10 days, 7 or 10 reports a day. And to have 50 within such a short space of time between an attack, that's a sharp increase of scrutiny of a physically and verbally aggressive kind. And the question was, what would you do about that?
Certainly. So I think it was answered within my original question. I'll reiterate that it's not only a Muslim issue. Specifically to Muslims, definitely we all need to band together, and if we see an attack on a Muslim, if we see an attack on any minority, is my point, in all minorities, we must learn the lesson from the Muslims. We must see what you're going through and understand that it goes through all communities that are minorities in this country, and it starts with logging it like these websites that you do have, making sure that government is aware of it, making sure that the general public is aware of the problem. Because if the general public don't even know there is a problem, then they might not stand up for those people. So we need to recognize that we are all one family, that the Muslim sister is my sister, that we are all one family, and that's it. You know, treat them like a human being.
Thank you. Suki Kaur, are we happy with the answers?
I think I
So what have you got?
a follow-up question. Okay. I think you all really did address why it happens and all that kind of thing, and it does happen, and there's enough on social media and media in itself to prove that these things are going on. Really what I'd like to follow up on is what Suki said, is about what are you going to do about sanctioning the people who are doing it, because it's all well and great knowing it's a problem, it's all well and great having the figures and having it recorded and having these people attacked, and we know it's happening, but what happens to the people on the other side? How do we get that message out that this isn't acceptable? Because creating that unity isn't going to happen overnight. It's going to take a long time to bring that unity together. And we've had this issue, you go back to the 60s and people of the black community, the Irish community, is it going to be where we're going to be in 50 years' time and it's going to be another minority who's going to be going through it? How do we crack down on it now and say this is not acceptable in our country?
I think Gurnaam Singh's got something to add to that.
I just wanted to kind of just put a broader context to some of this debate. There are some other very worrying developments that we need to throw into the pot. The first is the direction that UKIP are taking. I mean, for many years UKIP were on the rise. Partly they were mopping up some of the extreme vote because it was oriented towards an English nationalism, if you know, or a UK nationalism. Now that part of their project has kind of ended, and the recent manifesto launch of the UKIP as well kind of confirms this, that they're seemingly now targeting Muslim communities directly. And their kind of main, it's about stopping the Islamification of the UK, these kind of scaremongering. So I think that's a real worry in terms of maybe UKIP now turning towards more of their extreme xenophobic right-wing,
Overtly so.
Overt BNP kind of tendencies. So I'd like some comment on that. And also Katie Hopkins' recent, terrible statement, which again she's been sacked now, or she resigned. I don't know whether she resigned or sacked, but she's not on LBC. But for her to say that suggests that that it's the extreme right wing that is responsible for these attacks, not the working class, white working class people. In Manchester, for example, we saw a wonderful illustration that white working class people are decent people. And it's these extremists who are often in position of power that exploit those sentiments. So we really need to lance this idea that somehow it's white working class. They've been the victims of 30 years of right-wing policies. So I think that we do need to... it's a complicated situation.
I would say centuries of right-wing policies.
Who do we want?
Yeah,
I can go first if you want.
if you like, yes, please,
Yeah.
thank you.
So number one, to answer it as directly and as specifically as possible, I would increase much harsher penalties for the perpetrators and make examples out of people. So if it happens this week, it's international news, and you won't think about doing it twice. You'll think about what comes out of your mouth. You won't think about striking another person or committing a crime. Because I do believe that if the penalty is severe enough, that you won't do it. Now, this is proven just a couple of weeks back when the penalty points doubled for using a mobile phone in the cars. As soon as the penalty rose, it created real change in the habits of people in their daily lives. And where was the will before when mobile phones are proven to take lives, to kill babies, to kill whole families? But the people did not have the will, there was no political will to change that tragedy until the tougher laws were put into place, and then almost instantly overnight that changed. So number one, it would be much more harsher penalties for perpetrators, making examples out of people and recognizing it's also verbal abuse and it's physical abuse. And I don't think we should categorize certain people, because actually one of the main things that went through my mind when joining this political arena in this election cycle was the rise of UKIP, because I truly felt that whether it was their intention or not, that the conversation around Brexit was so diverse, so heated, so racially charged that it caused real racism on the street. I know we all felt it, and it was a sad time in our lives. And it opened my eyes as an apathetic voter and as an apathetic person within the political arena. It said, you know what? If they, with their ideas, because all politics at the end of the day is just sharing your own ideas, right? So if they, with their ideas, can cause real crime, hate abuse and physical abuse on the streets, why can't we, with our political party and our political agenda, do the opposite? So my campaign is for love. It's for caring, sharing, working hard, and taking care of your neighbor. And I know just being involved in the conversation and making sure it's steered around there and encouraging that, and even myself being helping add a bit more, let's say, diversity to this panel, you know, I think that's a win for us right there too. So I think it's going to take more people of different backgrounds to get involved, and for us to start treating crime as it is and make examples of people so they won't think of doing it twice.
Samantha, is legislation capable of stigmatizing social behavior to a point where it becomes socially unacceptable to behave in particular ways? With xenophobia in particular, considering we've had the 50s, 60s, 70s, the rise of the NF, the disappearance of the NF, the rise of the BNP, is legislation capable of achieving that?
I don't think it is on its own. Because I mean, we have laws at the moment about race hate crime, about, you know, so many things, and yet we see that it proliferates anyway. And I think largely that comes back to it's become almost socially acceptable now to say really hateful right-wing things. And Katie Hopkins is a prime example. Yeah. She became famous through being infamous for being essentially a horrible person. And the fact that she has been sacked or she's left LBC under whatever circumstances isn't going to mean she goes away. She's still a columnist for the Daily Mail, that wonderfully tolerant piece of journalism that we all know and love. So I don't think that just saying harsher prison sentences is an answer in itself. And what I come back to again, I'd said about the press previously, is imagining how would somebody like the Daily Mail report a sudden increase in harsher penalties for perpetrators of hate crimes against Muslims. I can only imagine the sorts of headlines that they would put out. And actually I think that it would it would cause and drive more division, which would then in turn probably drive up
they'd portray them as victims and as martyrs?
I think they probably would. I wouldn't put it past them at all, because you see all the time, you know, the minute that you come up to Easter or Christmas, all of a sudden the headlines are saying, oh, we can't say Easter egg now. We're not allowed to say Merry Christmas. And it's nonsense. It's absolute nonsense, but it's nonsense that sells. So they keep on printing it, and then it drives the division even more. And it's absolutely absurd that it's allowed to happen. And that really is what, to my mind, makes it socially acceptable for people to hold these views and voice these views, and then, you know, in turn go out and actually commit crimes against people. And I think we do have a problem with how then communities who are affected by this feel able to reach out to the police forces and the authorities that are supposed to protect them. We don't have a very well-funded police force anymore. The cuts there have dried up the flow of information, and they have increased crime as a direct result because of that. And we have, you know, even then systemic problems. So, you know, a piece of information I read earlier which says that hate crimes against Sikhs, when reported to the police, are recorded as Islamophobia. So they're not even recorded correctly. So how can you pin down
exactly how to tackle? Well, we've got the new website for that, to address that exact problem.
Yeah. So that's something that hopefully will start to address that problem. But it's meant historically, these, you know, all these hate crimes that have happened previously have been recorded as Islamophobia.
Without tougher laws, how are you possibly going to change somebody's habits? Because one thing that again came out with UKIP really was that people were quiet about their bigoted views. We thought through the 90s and the 2000s that we were living in a much more peaceful, secular, you know, a pluralistic society. But the second they got the chance to be open with their bigoted views, so I kind of discount what you're saying there, because unless we do have harsher penalties that are going to, I'm not living in some kind of fantasy world where I think that we're going to actually erase hate from the internal depths of somebody's heart when they are out there committing these evil acts of atrocities. But what we can do is control their behaviors. So we as minorities and people that are affected by these crimes should be able to feel safe to go out in the public and not be victimized. So I think tougher crime laws are going to help do that. And then we also need to work on that hate. That is a two-prong. So we need to work on building the community cohesions and actually working directly to help build the community into one society.
But tougher laws are only effective if they can be enforced.
Certainly.
And that's the difficulty here, is that we could come up with the laws and we could create the penalties here, but if we don't have the police force there to actually enforce them, if we don't have a police force where people in the community affected here feel that they can actually report what's happening and that it will genuinely be followed through, then tougher laws on
police.
Tougher laws on by themselves.
But that's not going to happen with the Tory government.
No, it's absolutely not. It's not. But again, and I think at the same time as saying that there have to be consequences and there have to be measures in place that mean that people from marginalised communities feel safer, and that people who perpetrate hate crimes of any nature face consequences for that, you have to come back, as you said, to the root cause, and I think it's a combination of the things that you and Chris have been saying.
But the thing is, I'm not actually only talking about the marginalised communities, I'm also talking about the white man, because I should not, or somebody else should not, be able to say anything racist to anybody, because that is also a hate crime. So all too often they get marginalised. So it's about every member of society. Yeah, obviously we need more police, we definitely need more police, but we need strict laws, and we need to make sure that's publicised, that if you do this, if you say this, that is not acceptable in our society, and then we will be able to change people's habits through that.
But I think, again, I'm so sorry, Chris, Dominic's not giving you a look in here, are we?
I'm making some notes.
I think we really can't overlook the role of social media, the press media in this, and subtle things as well that people discount, like, walking. I take my children, I was trying to explain to them what white privilege is. I'm white, my children are white, and I was trying to explain to them the concept, they're only small. And I took them into the corner shop, and I stood them in front of the rack of magazines, and I said, show me a single person on this rack of magazines who's not white. And they couldn't. Because we don't have that diversity and representation in all of these areas, it makes it so much easier for the right-wing press and for the right-wing extremists to marginalise people even further and to demonise people, driving the division, driving the hate that fuels these crimes.
Yes.
But it appears that we're quick to move to introduce terrorism legislation, and we can understand why. But going back to some of your questions, what about issues around race? And Stephen Lawrence, we learned a lot of lessons from Stephen Lawrence in 1993, and the inquiry took so long, and we just about got the Race Relations Act 2000, and I think we need more, don't we, in this country? But 2000 Terrorism Act comes out, then we have 2001 post 9/11, and 2005, 6, 8, 10, and just recently the CTSA, Counter Terrorism Security Act 2015. But isn't racism equally a bigger problem in another sense, where it does fuel issues around extremism, it does segregate communities? So I think we need to look a lot more around issues of race, just to tie into some of the questions there.
Does the prevent legislation actually sort of act contradictory to what it needs to be doing?
Well, in terms
is it responsible for a non-cohesive society?
Prevent as a counter-terrorism measure, and really this is my question, really, if I get the opportunity now, when Chris alluded to some of the points in regards to how we should address it in terms of front line, and in the UK, 2005 we had the terror attacks, and we know how many people got killed there, and we had, right up until what happened this week, and the atrocities, we had Westminster, we had Manchester. 80 plus people have been killed as a direct result of a terrorist attack in the UK, and we're aware what happened probably in 2007 when Jonathan Evans, a former MI5, warned us about the threat of young people being radicalised. So we got a big problem, because that's my question to the panel, really I can throw it back to the panel, is in light of these current terror attacks, what can be done to better protect children, young people at risk from becoming radicalised? And I think you probably answered some of that, but you can go into it. And in terms of prevent as a counter-terrorism measure, do you believe it's effective? I've delivered it, I've seen it in work, I've seen it change, I went to the last prevent review, I have my views on it and my research, but as far as the panel is concerned, individual, do you feel that we need more to better protect, and do you feel that prevent is an effective counter-terrorism response?
Well, I don't think prevent strategy is fit for purpose, and when I was leader of the council, made those criticisms at the time. And in terms of stopping radicalisation, it's not really worked in that sense. And I think some of the points I made in relation to the Al Majroon scenario in Derby, I think, is a microcosm of the sort of activities that we need to be doing and scaling up, as it were, to address that. I agree with everything I think that Samantha said. I completely disagree that stiffer penalties are the answer. We've already got hate crime on the statute book. Stiffer penalties won't work. On their own, they will not work. We've got to win hearts and minds. This is stiffer penalties, a kind of top-down approach. What we need to do is kind of engender a sense of social solidarity. And despite my youthful appearance, I remember the formation of the Anti-Nazi League when the National Front were on the rise in the late 1970s, and they were getting substantial votes in local elections, and they were standing sufficient candidates to put their kind of racist filth on party political broadcasts at that time. but it was by the community united together under the auspices of the Anti-Nazi League that I think, were able to push back the National Front at that time. It's not to say we obviously defeated them completely, because we didn't, but there are other factors which have come into play, which have helped to, I think, and I've touched on this already, exacerbate some of those tensions in communities.
I'm only a minute and a half away from an advert.
Okay, cool.
But you've said that the Prevent is not fit for purpose, the Prevent Act or the legislation. What in the manifesto do you propose to replace it with?
It was Labour that introduced it.
I appreciate that. I appreciate, yeah, absolutely. No, I agree. Well, listen, yeah. Well, yeah, absolutely.
But that's historic of Labour. They can't figure it out within their own party. It's one of the major problems.
There is no simplistic answer to these things. I think it was a bit of a knee-jerk reaction in that sense. I think probably over the best of motives. But it needs to be more sophisticated, I think. It was it's almost of a kind of a blunt instrument, if you like, too one-dimensional in that sense. And I think you need a much more sophisticated approach, and you've got to bring the community with you. You can't, propose these kind of solutions from on high in that sense. And that's why I come back to this thing and touching on some of the points I made earlier on. We've got to bring the community together. And one of the things I think Samantha touched on was in relation to the media. We've got to get a grip of the media, it seems to me, because they're actually driving a lot of the kind of bigotry which exists in this country. And one of the things that we've said very clearly is that we will implement Leveson in full, and I think that will go a long way to actually, tackling the abuse, frankly, that the right-wing media are indulging in, which is actually helping to ferment some of. And you kind of made the point, I think, some of the kind of race hate that we are beginning to see surface again. But stiffer penalties, I don't think will work.
Well, unless you're not going to put stiffer penalties on the media, then how are you going to regulate them? So I think it comes back to the
you've got to win hearts and minds. You've asked a very, very relevant question. We're just going to go to a break now. We're going to come back with that very question. Okay, we'll see you after the break for more of the debate. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
Bole sone haal